So welcome again to Dr. Bob Gill. How you doing, Bob?
Very well, Crispin.
Today we're going to be talking about the COVID vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which has made the news recently. I put an email out to people to highlight that we were going to talk about that, and I just thought I'd show this response. I've blurred out the name of the person so they can't be incriminated. The heading of the email was, "Were anti-vaxxers right?" And the answer from this person is no, they weren't. Please don't give these lunatics the oxygen of publicity. That sort of sums up a lot of the kind of heated division on the vaccines that we had back in the time when they were out, and a lot of people being told if they didn't take the vaccine that they were killing people. So there's a lot of high stakes involved in talk about the vaccine. There were ideas that people had to have a passport. Some people didn't get jobs because they hadn't had the vaccine. It was a pretty divisive issue for some people, and there were names people called Covidiots and anti-vaxxers, and it was all quite divisive. It's all come back out again in the last week, and I'm just going to go through the details on what I've looked up here. Now, the AstraZeneca vaccine was one of three, as I remember, in this country, and this was from NHS England on Friday, the 7th of May, 2021. We are writing to you following today's updated independent joint committee on vaccination and immunisation guidance in relation to the use of AstraZeneca vaccine for some people aged under 40. The updated guidance states, and then if we look at this paragraph, it says JCVI advises that in addition to those aged under 30, unvaccinated adults aged 30 to 39 years who are not in a clinical priority group at higher risk of severe COVID-19 disease should be preferentially offered an alternative to the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine where possible, and only where no substantial delay or barrier in access to vaccination would arise. The point of that kind of change in guidance was that there was some reports on which, and this is from the BBC at the time, which says how Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine may cause rare blood clots. The vaccine is made of COVID genetic material combined with a weaker version of the common cold virus, is injected into the muscle, but sometimes leaks into the bloodstream. There it can attract a protein in the blood, platelet factor 4. In rare cases, the immune system confuses platelet factor 4 for the virus and releases antibodies to attack it. Antibodies clump together with platelet factor 4, triggering blood clots. So even at the time, there were some fears about this. I mean, this is the BBC. It's not some kind of strange website that people might, I don't know. It isn't the web. It's the BBC. So this is the story of the legal challenge that's been mounted against AstraZeneca over the COVID vaccine. I'll just read out what it says. This is the BBC's report. AstraZeneca is facing legal action over its COVID vaccine by a man who suffered severe brain injury after having the jab in April 2021. Father of two, Jamie Scott, suffered a blood clot that left him with brain damage and unable to keep working. The action, taken under the Consumer Protection Act, alleges the vaccine was defective as it was less safe than individuals were entitled to expect. Then we've got some kind of disclaimers in the sense to what was said by, this is the BBC, studies suggest COVID vaccines have saved millions of lives. In June 2022, the World Health Organization said the AstraZeneca vaccine was safe and effective for individuals aged 18 and above. It says here, the legal action is at least a year away from a full court hearing. A further claim from about 80 people who say they were injured by the AstraZeneca vaccine is also due to be launched later this year, but Mr. Scott's case is expected to be heard first. AstraZeneca said patient safety is our highest priority, and regulatory authorities have clear and stringent standards to ensure the safe use of all medicines, including vaccines. Our sympathy goes out to anyone who has lost loved ones or reported health problems. from the body. I don't really want to read much more of that because it's just a legal defense. What's interesting is this bit here. It says wholly insufficient. Many of the claimants have received one-off fixed tax-free payments of £120,000 under the government's vaccine damage payment scheme, which I didn't know anything about, which provides compensation for those injured or to bereave next of kin. Official figures obtained under the Freedom of Information request showed at least 144 out of 148 vaccine damage payment scheme payments had gone to recipients of the Astra Zeneca vaccine. So that's over 90. That's probably 99%. The Daily Telegraph reported. An attempt to have the VDPS overhauled is at the heart of these legal actions. Claimants have to show the vaccine caused serious disability of at least 60%, and the families say the level of compensation is wholly insufficient and has not been adjusted for inflation since 2007. On the 7th of April 2021, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation advised adults aged under 30, this is what we've already seen, to be offered an alternative to the AstraZeneca vaccine following reports of extremely rare blood clots in a very small number of people. On 7th May 2021, the guidance was amended to adults aged under, that's what we've seen, aged under 40. Mr. Scott was aged 44 when he received the AstraZeneca vaccine on 23rd of April 2021. Kate Scott, Jamie's wife, told the BBC Jamie has over 250 rehabilitation and to walk again, to swallow, to talk. He's had memory problems. Although he has done very well with them, we are at the point now where this new version of Jamie is the version that will go forward. He has cognition problems, he has aphasia, severe headaches, blindness. She added, we need the government to reform the vaccine damage payment schemes, insufficient and unfair, and then fair compensation. Yeah, well, I'd say 120,000 is not anything like what you would expect for the damage that was caused to that man or to people who died from. There's certainly not enough for someone who's died. Now, Bob, this is a very contentious subject, and people have branded all sorts of things for saying anything about it. But the problem I've got with this is, was it dangerous to not trial these vaccines? That's the first thing I'm interested to know.
Yes, thank you for going through the detail of the case. Let's just remind ourselves, why were people having the jab? Well, you got high-risk people, but then you also have low-risk people. And there was a coordinated attempt by government and the media to coerce, to shame, to bully, and to ridicule people who were hesitant to take the vaccine. Now, why might they have been hesitant? Well, they may have already had COVID and recovered. So they would have had natural immunity, which is better than any vaccine. They may have considered themselves very low risk, fit and healthy. So why have the vaccine? And then we went on to find out that the vaccines didn't stop you getting COVID again, or didn't protect you from transmitting it to others. So the premise for a lot of the shaming and the propaganda was completely flawed. We know this now. But yet there was a very heavy attempt to force people into having it. Now, this 44-year-old chap, Jamie Scott, we don't know about his medical history, but I put it to you, if he was otherwise fit and well, then he was subjected to a medical intervention for which there was insufficient long-term data. The fact is that these vaccines were rushed out. It normally takes, up to 10 years to develop a vaccine. Well, these were developed within a year. And they were pushed on low-risk people. But let's not remember the basics of medical practices. First, do no harm. And now we know, the data from Pfizer's own original trials was that 1 in 800 people were getting a severe adverse reaction requiring hospitalization. 1 in 800. And typically, previous vaccines have been withdrawn if you had an adverse rate of 1 in 100,000. So wow. For some mysterious reason, these vaccines were not only rushed out, but the drug companies had data on high adverse events yet still organizations like the WHO and our government and the media were repeating a marketing line of safe and effective. And they sold all this to us by quoting very selective statistics, which were not challenged in the slightest. So, there's a big problem, I expect, with these court cases that are going on. There are court cases taking place in the States against Pfizer. One other person named in this case that has just gone through, which the High Court has said will go further, has given permission for it to go further, was the case of a 35-year-old lady, Alpa Taylor, who died. Now, how can you justify giving a medical intervention to a low-risk person that kills them? There is no justification for it. So we went into we've had a 2-year stint of collective insanity and polarization, which was top down. This was coming from government and coming from multinational organizations like the WHO, and who've been the beneficiaries? The big pharmaceutical companies.
Right. I mean, I like to high adverse reactions, and you say it's 1 in 800 for the Pfizer, and 1 in 100,000 would be acceptable for a normal vaccine or medicine, I suppose.
Yeah, higher than that, they would have been pulled off the market and never used.
And the fact that it was deemed an emergency and we had to get this out as soon as possible, how do you reply to that?
Well, it's an emergency, but it was only predominantly killing people over 80 who were very vulnerable and had other pre-existing medical conditions. But it was pretty much similar to the flu for everybody else, particularly everybody else under the age of 50. So there was no reason to extend this vaccine madness to people under the age of 50. And both of the cases that we've been hearing about, Alpa Taylor and Jamie Scott, were both under 50. You mentioned the NHS England guidance changing and warning about clots, but it was withdrawn. The Astra Zeneca vaccine was withdrawn in Germany in March for everybody. It was taken off the shelf. The UK, Boris Johnson was trumpeting that this was a triumph of British science. So I believe the British hesitancy was because it was embarrassing for them, having made so much of AstraZeneca and coming from Oxford, and there was a bit of jingoism and patriotism. I had patients demanding the Oxford jab instead of the Pfizer jab because they felt that this was top-notch stuff. But it was marketing. That's what people fell for. So there are big problems in the pipeline, and claims that the drug companies made misled people into the safety of these interventions and also the efficacy.
Wow. Yeah. So the government was in a position to know the details and didn't do anything because it didn't want to lose face with it being a British thing that Boris Johnson had triumphed. Now,
in Germany, they withdrew it in March. In the UK, they said it's safe for everybody over 30 in April. And then they moved it later on to say it's safe for everybody over 40. And then they quietly banned it to save face. That's why they did it that way.
Now, the other part of this that was going around a lot was if you didn't have the vaccine, then you were going to kill people because I'm not quite sure how that worked, but what the reasoning is on that. But can you tell us about that? I mean, what was all that about? I mean, is that nonsense generally, or is that something that was true of COVID, or I don't know?
No, it was nonsense because it's hard to vaccinate people against a coronavirus. We've known this for decades. What we need is hypothetically a vaccine that gives you mucosal immunity, stops you breathing in through your nose and your mouth a virus, and it kills it off within your mucosa. Well, that hasn't been achieved. So these vaccines were never theoretically going to be very good at stopping you getting it again and stopping you passing it on to somebody else once you did get it again. So this idea that you would block transmission was completely false. And Pfizer had to declare this in the European Parliament, where one of their employees actually said, we never tested for transmissibility. Yet the government and the media were telling us you must have the shot, even if you're fit and well, even if you've recovered from COVID, to protect granny. And this was a bogus argument.
Right. Now, you sent me a chart as well, which is pretty alarming. The scale of the COVID-19 injection efficacy lie, what they told you it did and what it actually does. Now we've got jab type. So we look at Astra Zeneca, Oxford, the marketing lie, relative risk reduction. They said it was 66.84%. The absolute risk reduction from the jab was 1.28%. Can you kind of explain what that means?
Yeah, so if you take 100 people and you take another 100 people, you give them a placebo, you give them a blank. And to the other 100 people, you give them the vaccine. And you monitor them in terms of how many people die 3 months, 6 months later of COVID. Now, let's say hypothetically, in the unvaccinated 100 people, 2 died. And in the vaccinated 100 people, 1 died. Now, the relative risk reduction from 2 to 1 is 100%. But the absolute risk reduction is 1%. And what does Big Pharma tell us about? It tells us about the 100%. So this is where you get this 100% effective or 95% effective. And the slide you've got up at the moment shows a summary which was published in a well-respected journal, The Lancet, which looked at the data from that the drug companies provided. And surprise, surprise, they always quoted the very flattering statistic. But if you told a fit and well 44-year-old, let's assume Jamie Scott was one of them, that if he had the AstraZeneca vaccine, it would give him 1.28% protection, I put it to you, he would have rejected it. Why would you put yourself at risk if you've already, especially if you've recovered from COVID? Let's not forget, natural immunity is far better than any vaccine because you're exposed to, multiple antigens. In a vaccine, it tends to be one antigen that provokes an antibody response, an immune response.
Right. Now, look, I mean, I can see the logic of everything you're saying, but what you're saying. We'll go back to the slide I showed at the start. Were anti-vaxxers right? No, they weren't. Please don't give these lunatics the oxygen of publicity. Now, that would probably come from someone who'd be called on the left of politics. Now, I know that on the left of politics, not many people were questioning the vaccine, and it seemed to fall into the lap of people like Lawrence Fox and the right wing, who are, as we've seen with what's going on in Palestine, extremely racist, Islamophobic people. However, because they were saying this vaccine needs to be questioned, they got a bit of traction, and that's where their tractions come from. So I'm wondering if it's time that people on the left took up this issue instead of allowing it to be taken up by these right wingers. What's your take on it?
Absolutely. The trick has been, unfortunately, the people on the left, if you dress any policy up in virtue, they're going to fall for it. They abandon their critical thinking skills and say, well, if the government are telling me this is a good thing for my neighbor and my relatives, even if I don't need it, I'm going to take it. So they fell for that virtue dress, the virtue camouflage of taking the vaccine. I remember coming on your show and expressing hesitancy quite early on, particularly from the perspective of vaccine passports and mass surveillance. Again, that was taken up by the right wing. The other problem we have is, unfortunately, you know, many on our side, if a right-winger states a truth, they will avoid agreeing with them. It's a psychological mental block, I'm afraid. I don't really care who says it. If I agree with it, I will agree with them. And I'll say, look, I agree with 90% of what you say on other issues, but on this issue, I agree with you. That's where we need to be waking up. And, you know, where we have commonality with people on the other side of the political spectrum, we should admit it and say, well, they've got a point. You know, we need to protect ourselves against coercion. We need to protect our civil rights. We mustn't be locking up people who refuse the vaccine. That, you know, some people were advocating that, weren't they, on the left? So there is this, you know, potentially authoritarian streak on the left if they believe it's for some communal benefit. So that's where they fell over.
Is there anything else you want to say?
Yeah, so the Astra Zeneca vaccine was produced in a more traditional way, but the problem I can see coming down the pipeline is that relating to mRNA gene therapies. Now, they're not traditional vaccines. In fact, they changed the definition of vaccine to be able to call them vaccines, but they're not vaccines. They are produced in a novel way. They were surrounded by lipid nanoparticles. Supposedly both mRNA and the lipid nanoparticles were supposed to stay in your arm, but there's growing evidence that they spread widely through the body. They created an unpredictable immune response to produce more spike protein and to generate immunity from that spike protein, all unpredictable. And there's a whole class of adverse events that we're going to hear more about, including clotting, autoimmunity, myocarditis of the heart, sudden death secondary to silent myocarditis. And there's some concern that the mRNA vaccines, the production for mass use, used a different method to the production used in the trials. So you had a cheaper production method. And by doing that, unfortunately, there's been more contamination of the vaccine. And there are independent researchers from America, from Germany, and I believe from Japan, separate teams that have raised this issue about DNA contamination of the Pfizer mRNA vaccine, which may have an effect on how your cells work and how your cells respond to early cancer changes. So there is a huge scandal brewing, but you wouldn't hear any of this on mainstream news outlets, I'm afraid. Can I just say one other thing, Crispin? To his credit, the other issue is of rising excess deaths. You know, in many countries, particularly the heavily vaccinated countries, and Andrew Brigden, former Tory MP, raised this issue of excess deaths and the need for an investigation in Parliament, to an empty Parliament, an almost empty Parliament. And what he's calling for is an investigation into why are we still having excess deaths in this country, given that COVID has passed, and the most vulnerable people, if they were going to succumb to COVID, they've already passed on. How do we explain these excess deaths? And calling for an investigation into that. And, you know, time-wise, the rollout of this, the rushed rollout of all these vaccines, and a year or two later, the continued excess deaths, we need to work out whether this is an association or cause and effect.